it should work that only the people that are spotlit for everyone are the people on our recording. So, but anyway, good evening. Thank you all for being with us tonight. You are here at the Preparing Kids for a Diverse World program, a collaboration between Barrington Area Library and Be The Change Barrington. For this session, we are going to hear from Dr. Harvey in a few minutes about her book, Raising White Kids. And after her presentation, there will be an opportunity to ask questions. We just went over how we're going to do that since we don't have the chat, but we'll make it happen that everyone will be able to ask questions that they want. With that being said, my name is Demetra Bedino Mendoza. I am a youth services librarian at Barrington Area Library. A lot of you may have seen me. Usually I'm on the floor with the kids doing like baby times and toddler times. So this is fun that I get to engage in more adult conversation for this program for the evening. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Sam.
Great. Thank you so much, Demetra. My name is Sam Adams Lanham. I am the Community Engagement Librarian at the Barrington Area Library. So that means that my programs are primarily for or with local community organizations. I've recently partnered with groups as varied as the League of Women Voters, National Alliance on Mental Illness of the Barrington area, Kaleidoscope School of Fine Arts, and Go Green Barrington. And that was pretty much just in October. So it's a busy month. If you are active in a local nonprofit and have an idea for a resource that would be of value to the community, please reach out to me. I'll be saying my email address a lot, but it is sadams@balibrary.org. This program is here tonight because two local nonprofits, Courageous Conversations and Be The Change Barrington, approached us, as well as numerous residents, library users asking for a program like this with the conversations that we've been having about race in the community and in the wider world recently. So with that, I would like to introduce you to a member of today's collaborator, Be The Change Barrington, and that is Grant Elliott.
Thanks, Sam. My name is Grant Elliott. I am a member of this Barrington community for now 15 years on the day. Went to North Barrington Elementary School, went to Station Middle School, and graduated from Barrington High School in 2016. This year, in this wild year, I graduated from Northwestern University and had the pleasure of joining and creating Be The Change Barrington with 84 other coalition members, mostly Barrington High School graduates, but also some current students and Barrington community members. Our mission is to move the Barrington community in a more inclusive direction for minority students and families through improving the culture and discussion around social justice, starting with dialogue in Barrington 220 schools. Again, our work is by no means done. And while we have a lot of data points, we still have to apply them and bring the narratives to life. And I think today's guest is going to help do that and help us move towards a more inclusive Barrington. The Reverend Dr. Jennifer Harvey serves as a professor of religion and faculty director of the Cru Scholars Program, an academic excellence and leadership development program for students of color at Drake University. She graduated from Union Theological Seminary in the city of New York with a Master of Divinity degree in 1998 and a PhD in Christian social ethics in 2004. She is ordained in the American Baptist churches. Her work focuses on ethics and race, gender, sexuality, activism, spirituality, and politics. Her greatest passion and longtime work, however, persistently and pointedly returned to racial justice and white anti-racism. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Harvey.
Thank you so much, Grant and Sam and Demetra. I'm so glad to be with you all tonight. Thank you for the invitation. I'm in awe, learning a little bit about Be The Change. That's amazing. This is how we grow the world we need. So yeah, I'm really honored to be with you all tonight as part of this initiative. Thank you all for showing up in really difficult days for many of our communities. We're all going through a lot. So it's good to be together, even though it's a different way of being together in these Zoom spaces. So I want to take some time to share some stories with you. to lay the groundwork for some conversations and dialogue that we will be emailing back and forth about. And I'm going to start then by just a real story, an actual story that a mom told to me a few years ago now. She said to me, I was so relieved when my second grader came home after her school's Martin Luther King Jr. Day celebration. I'd been worried about what she'd be taught. Like, I thought they might sugarcoat things. But then when she came home, my daughter was so excited about everything she'd learned, and her school had done a great job. But after sharing all she'd learned, my daughter then turned to me and said, you know what, Mom? I'm so glad we're white. And I thought, oh my God, do we say that? So let's imagine this child had been Latina and she had come home after a day celebrating a Latina justice leader and burst into the house and said, Mom, I'm so glad we're Latinas. I don't think her mother's first response would have been an angst-ridden, like, oh my goodness, oh no, do we say that? And very likely actual children in that actual second grade class did go home that day and say things like, you know what, Dad, I'm so glad we're Black. And I can imagine many of fathers' response saying back, indeed, we are glad we're Black. But the racial landscape is just fundamentally different when we start talking about white kids. And here is the difference. It's a very important difference. If you are committed to equity, and if you value justice, but you are living in a racially unjust society that also privileges you in that injustice, you face some very real conundrums that show up when a kid says something like, I'm so glad we're white. Do we say that? So these conundrums impact white kids' development from their very earliest of days. Of course, race impacts all children's development, and all of our children need support to navigate a society that is simultaneously very diverse and deeply unjust. But we know from lots of studies that parents of children of color tend to offer their kids that support. We know that parents of children of color teach their kids explicitly about the ways race matters in their lives at rates 2 to 5 times higher than do white parents. In contrast, we also know that 75% of white families with kindergartners never or almost never talk about race with theirs. That's from at this point now, it feels like an older study that explains a lot of the angst white families had this summer when they had to suddenly talk about race. Like there was no way they could not, right? 75% of white families report they don't talk about race with their 5-year-olds. And that is a lot of white silence. And that's what I want to talk about to set the table tonight. I want to talk a little bit about what white silence looks like. I want to talk a little bit about why it's so dangerous. And then I want to talk, most importantly, about what some counter responses are. You might have seen, I suspect some of you about, I think it was spring of 2017. There was a story that made the rounds on the news about these 2 4-year-old boys. One was white, one was Black, and they were best friends. And these 2 little boys, the story went, they got matching haircuts because they were trying to see if their teacher would be able to tell them apart. They thought they could trick her. And the friendship was really, really sweet. Their friendship was just sort of like really compelling. And so the story got a lot of attention for that reason. But I also came to realize sort of early in the news cycle that it was getting attention because it also seemed to endorse white silence as a good parenting strategy. These 2 4-year-olds thinking they could trick their teacher by getting matching haircuts when one of them was white, one of them was Black, seemed to be proof that kids can be taught not to see color, and 2, that when they can, that's a good thing. I actually heard the mom of the white 4-year-old tell a reporter that his, quote, inability to see difference was a parental success because, she said, I just taught him to love everyone the same. And those words, sound very nice, but this is of course a version of what we might call colorblind teaching, but I want us to start calling it instead white silence, because that's what it is. It's a way of thinking about race that's prevalent in white families, that overwhelmingly African-American families, Latino families do not pretend that we cannot see color, and they also don't think that's a good thing, right? And so that's something we need to call it white silence instead of colorblindness. And the reality is that despite this sort of attraction white families have to the language of, I just taught him to love everybody the same, that way of teaching about race backfires in some pretty profound ways. And we know from many studies that it backfires because, just to give you one example, in 2006, there was about 100 white families that were researchers engaged. And these families said that their approach to race was to teach their kids that everybody's equal. They were committed to this. These were not families trying to explicitly teach racism. And so the researchers pulled the kids aside who were in this study of 100 families, and they asked them, when their parents weren't in the room, a very direct question, very blunt question. The researchers said to the children of these everybody's equal families, do your parents like Black people? 38% of kids being raised in these everybody's equal families said, I don't know. And 14% of those kids said, nope, my parents don't like Black people. That's more than half of those kids if you put those two data sets together. You see, it turns out everybody's equal is literally so abstract, kids have no idea what it means. They literally don't know and understand. They're supposed to somehow connect that to actually valuing people, whatever our skin colors, hair textures, accents, names, etc. And more troubling, that teaching literally does nothing to counteract racism in children. So before I talk a little bit about the dangers of white silence, I want to say very explicitly, this is not just a parenting problem. And that's why this is actually a critical community conversation, because a ton of adults are involved when it comes to raising kids, whether you have kids as a primary caregiver in your life or not. Teachers, clergy, librarians, aunts, coaches, community leaders, neighbors, grocery store clerks. If you have ever seen a child or a child has seen you, you have helped raise that child, which should give us some pause, right? Raising children is a generational work. We are all raising the next generation. It's also not just about white kids, because the reality is that what adults like me are or aren't able to say to children about race and anti-racism has everything to do with where the adults are in our understanding and in our abilities. In fact, so much of what I'm talking about these days in terms of raising white children and youth is so relevant and so important in our current political racial climate in the nation. It's so relevant because so many white adults are struggling to talk about race and racism and anti-racism with our children because we ourselves were raised with so-called colorblind teaching, right? Or white silence. And so thus we're not able to really talk about it in the ways we need to. And finally, this is not just about white kids. White silence impacts kids of color, impacts teenagers of color, 20-somethings, professionals, colleagues, all of whom come into contact with white kids and white teenagers and white 20-somethings and colleagues and professionals. So this is a multiracial conversation because everybody is impacted when it comes to the question of how white kids and youth are being socialized in the United States of America. Okay, so why is white silence so dangerous? What does it produce? I'm going to give you just 2 examples, and we can maybe have more examples in the question discussion time, but I'll take a pass at the young kid example and then kind of a teenager example. So we know from countless studies, again, this has been studied so much, that children internalize racist perceptions of themselves and of others by the ages of 3 and 4. And this is all children. It's not just white children. Internalize racist perceptions of selves and others by the ages of 3 and 4. By the age of 5, kids recognize that racial groups are treated differently and they understand something about racial social status. Age 5. That's the age, remember that 75% statistic? 75% of white families aren't talking about this with their kids, but their kids already know that people of different racial groups are treated differently. Also, by the age of 5, kids know that mostly they're not supposed to talk about this in front of adults, which should really, really concern us. So there was one study of preschoolers that discovered that over and over again, kids would play with larger social messages about race, messages that most adults assume go right over children's heads. And I'll just give you one example from this study that stood out to me, and this is now the researcher's language, it's not mine. She writes, and she's observing this, there's a white girl pulling 2 other girls, one is white, one is Asian, in a wagon. The wagon gets stuck, and the Asian girl jumps out to help. The white girl responds, no, you can't pull this wagon. Only white Americans can pull this wagon. Renee has her hands on her hips and she frowns at Ling Mei. The Asian girl tries again to lift the handle of the wagon, and Renee again insists that only white Americans are permitted to do this task. This is a 4-year-old. She's using white racial assumptions about who counts as American in her play. And she's doing it in a very sophisticated way. And about now, lots of us might be tempted to say something like this. Well, oh my gosh, what are they teaching that child at home? That's what I would have said before I actually had kids, because I was a really good parent before I had kids. And then I actually had them and I realized they say all kinds of things they did not get at home. We have to resist that temptation, that explanation. That could be what's going on at home, but it's just as likely that is not what's happening at home. Because you see, that's not how this works. Adults tend to think that when kids display racism, the cause is a few rogue, bad adult parental apples. Like, oh my God, what are those parents doing? We have got to understand that racism is smog, and that is Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum's term. We all are breathing the smog of racism every day, says Dr. Tatum. So if the problem is smog, then white silence, if we just are silent about race, we're just as likely to end up with this wagon scenario as if a child is hearing specific teachings at home that only white people can be American citizens. Because white silence is basically the equivalent of refusing to give your 4-year-old a breathing mask. And so racist smog is out there, and we just send our 4-year-old out into the world where she breathes in racism, negative stereotypes about people of color, false beliefs about her own superiority in this case, and then she breathes it right back out in the world. And that is how powerful smog is. And I will just tell you, I know smog is real. My kids have 2 moms. We are both feminists. We talk about sexism. And I could tell you a million stories about my 2 children, one of whom is a girl, one of whom is non-binary, making sexist comments, things I know they did not get from their 2 moms at home, right? But that's how powerful smog is. Kids breathe stuff in and they breathe it right back out. So we've got to start to wrestle with that as communities, that racism is smog. And so kids are breathing it in. What do breathing masks look like? Okay, here's the teenager description of what white silence can yield. And this description gets really eerie in our current racial political climate. So this is an old study, and it chilled me at the time, but it's been increasingly disturbing me in the last 4 to 5 years. Another researcher spent a year doing interviews in a high school, and this high school was very racially diverse, and it was offering the students a multicultural curriculum. So it was explicitly trying to teach a kind of inclusion for its messaging. And this researcher started each interview with the teenagers in the high school, where she spent a full year, asking students to tell her their age, their sex, gender, their grade, and their race and ethnicity, which seems like pretty straightforward stuff. Something fascinating happens. White students couldn't answer the race part of the question. They were fine in answering the question about their age, their sex, their grade, but they would start squirming with the race part. Students of color had no problem saying what their racial identity was. This part of the question never made them squirm. But the white students would squirm. So some of them would give ironic answers. She describes one boy who broke into a fake British accent kind of abruptly and says, well, I'm the whitest of the white boys. He is kind of like mocking his whiteness and celebrating it at the same time in this weird way. And other students would play ignorant or seem really uncomfortable. So they would do things like say, well, I'm white. Actually, no, you know what? My mom told me we're Dutch. We're Dutch. That's right. We come from the Netherlands, right? Or they would go, I'm white, I guess. So when she pushes on this, Mary Buchholz, the researcher, discovers two things. She discovers that these white high schoolers are literally not sure if saying I'm white is the same thing as saying I'm racist. And they know they don't want to be that. And so they get really uncomfortable when they get near it, when they have to tell what their racial identity is. And the other thing that's going on is that there's a narrative in the school that associates whiteness with, quote, cultural blandness and a lack of coolness. And sometimes the young people in the school, all the kids, not just the white kids, will say it as kind of a joke. But other times it's clearly very painful to some of the white teenagers. And this is really, really important. Because imagine that you're at an age, high school, where being uncool is about the worst thing you can be. You are being told you're supposed to value diversity, but everybody knows that doesn't mean your diversity, right? So you're not supposed to celebrate your whiteness, right? And so this is the equation we have put these young people in. You cannot embrace your race. Everyone else gets to embrace theirs. You're supposed to enjoy embracing your much cooler peers' racial difference all the while. That's the equation. What do we think the result will be? Well, what the result is, this researcher discovers very quickly, is that these white teenagers are very resentful. They don't resent or name frustration with their teachers or their parents who did not help them learn to talk about, walk into, think about race and anti-racism and what their participation in a multicultural paradigm might be. What they start to resent is the whole enterprise of diversity. And some of them are actually starting to feel pretty hostile about it. And of course, who do they direct that hostility towards? They direct it towards Black and Latinx students in the school, right? So everyone's been set up to fail in this scenario. And this scenario right here gave me stress 10 years ago in our nation state. And right now, that is precisely white teenager angst is being responded to by some of the, I'll just say, the most, from my perspective, frightening elements in the current racial crisis we are experiencing, because they've got answers. They'll tell those young people, it's fine to be white. We're going to give you a positive identity. Here it is. And we need to fight for those young people and say, no, they need something different from us. They need it for their own sake, and their peers of color need it for their own sake. We've got to respond to these youth. So this is urgent, really urgent. And we have to break silence. We have to break white silence. And it's long-term work, but it's also work that we've got to start in this very moment as our nation just roils with the crisis of racial injustice. If we want white youth who are ready to participate in a multiracial project for justice, we have got to talk to white young people about what white anti-racism could look like, what it might mean. Okay, so how do we do that? How do we break silence? I'm going to offer a couple of possibilities and then we'll move to some discussion. We need to break silence in a number of ways. I'll just offer three. First of all, we need to create race and justice conscious schemas. So this is like the opposite of pretending we're colorblind. We're going to be conscious about race. We're going to be conscious about justice, And this is an analogy I'll give you to help illustrate this. As I already told you, my kids have 2 moms, which means they've always just known families can have more than one mom. And so even though dominant culture will tell them 2 girls can't get married, or you have to have a mom and a dad, when my children hear those messages, they think those messages are outliers, that they're strange, that like the messages need some sort of explanation. It never occurs to my kids that they're the outliers who have to be somehow explained. And that's what schemas are. There are these underlying patterns that our kids learn early that they use to make sense out of the world. They make up our deepest assumptions about what is normal. So for my kids, multiple moms is just a thing that is. It's fine. No explanation needed. We have got to do something exactly like that when it comes to race with white kids. Families of color already do this. White families do not. We've got to start doing that. We've got to make talking about race, naming injustice and racism, teaching our kids about it. That's the second thing. And third, the truth that people are constantly taking action against racism. We have to make those 3 things the most basic part of white kids' schemas. Talking about race, that is something we do. Naming racism and injustice, that is something we do. And the truth that people are constantly taking action against racism, part of white kids' most basic schemas. There's tons of ways to do this. Early and often race talk is essential. Being explicit about racism. And some of the most important ways include getting our kids in spaces where people are resisting racism or talking about diversity, being there with them so that they start assuming it's the most normal thing in the world to challenge racism when it shows up. I don't want my kids to ever go, oh, do I challenge this racist comment? Nope, I don't want my kids to ever think that question. I want them to just go, of course you challenge it. It's the most normal thing you do when racism shows up is to challenge it because it's part of their basic schema. Okay, secondly, racial scripts are powerful. And when I say scripts, I mean scripts like a play. So I have heard a ton of white parents over the years talk about valuing diversity, putting their kids in diverse spaces on purpose because that's a value, and then being really disappointed when their kids could not sustain interracial friendships, that their kids didn't stay friends with kids of color. And one of the things we have got to come to terms with is that whatever our unique personalities, commitments, identities, whatever those are, all of our individual lives are unfolding in a larger racial story. And this story began long before we did, and it's being rewritten every single day, oftentimes in ways we don't want it to be rewritten. But what it means is I've been handed a role in the story. And in some ways, it just doesn't matter who I am, at least not at first. The day after yet another Black person is killed by police, when I pass a Black person in my city of Des Moines on the street, it doesn't matter that in the 90s, I did anti-police brutality organizing in New York City. I did that in the 90s. It doesn't matter that I did that. When I pass that Black person on the street who doesn't know me, I'm just another white person. Our national racial wounds, violence, and trauma literally exist in the air between us, between our roles. It's the script into which our lives have been written. And so national racial wounds, racial violence, all the trauma, they mediate our encounters with one another, and especially our initial encounters. And many times they prevent us from getting much further than initial encounters. Racial scripts are about our collective relationships, and they operate in our children's lives too. We shouldn't expect our kids to be immune from them. There's a reason our kids begin to become unable to sustain interracial friendships. It's because they're not immune from the scripts. So for example, if I only teach my daughter who is white, if the only thing I teach her about police is that they are safe, go find one if you're in trouble. If that's all I ever say, then her relationship with her cousin who is Black is who is necessarily being taught that police are complicated for him, their friendship will be impacted. They can cousin love each other all they want at ages 10 and 13. Within a few years, the depth of their friendship will erode. That is how the script will play out. Here's another kind of example of scripts, a different kind of example that's a kind of funny example. I have another nephew who's African-American, and when he attends a racially diverse school here in Des Moines, and when he was about 5, he's a child who is very, very, very funny, very smart. He can make adults squirm by, like, if there's a bunch of adults in a room who don't want to talk about something awkward because there's an elephant in the room, he'll be the person that points at the elephant and somehow says something funny about it to make the adults have to deal with it. He loves to like play with discomfort. He's brilliant. So when he was 5, this was a few years ago now, we were having family dinner and he was talking about having played dodgeball at school that day. And he announced to the adults at the table, "We're not supposed to say black kids against the white kids," T said. And we all started laughing because we know that meant he had done that at school that day. And then when we asked him if he knew why the teachers didn't want him to do that, he was like, "Nope, they just said don't say that." And I suspect that in the mix of this is that there was some developmental naivete, but that there was also an emerging awareness of kid racial tension, and my nephew was playing with it. And I was really sad that the teachers hadn't felt equipped to explore this with him as well as the other children who heard him say that. Because the silence that those children were offered in response, the silence of, "Oh my gosh, don't say that," really leaves all of those kids more likely to succumb to racial scripts ultimately, because those kids are going to find a different way to square off as black and white, if not in dodgeball. They've all been handed roles, and by kindergarten, age 6, they're starting to know it. And so I was trying to imagine, what could those teachers have done instead that would have interrupted the script? Like, "Oh, that's an interesting idea. What made you think of that?" A conversation instead of a shushing no. Or, "Well, what about white kids and black kids who are friends? Would they be allowed to play on each other's teams if they wanted to?" Or, "But how do we know who's white and who's black? What about kids whose families are black and white? What about kids who are from Vietnam or who are Latino? Do they get to play?" Or, that's interesting. Have you seen people divided up like that and going against each other like that in other places? Does that happen in Des Moines? Does that happen in our school? And that line of questioning would have, I guarantee, elicited fascinating things that kids are observing in that school or in the city of Des Moines that teachers typically don't even get to hear about, because kids by that age know they're not really supposed to talk about it in front of adults. I want to be really, really clear. I'm not suggesting kids should be allowed to play racially divided dodgeball. That is not the takeaway. The takeaway is this is a prime opportunity. This story is a great example of a chance for exploratory race and justice conscious dialogue with a 5-year-old. Amazing. It could have been amazing. But for that to happen, quite frankly, adults have to stop underestimating our children. And frankly, we have to stop freaking out. We have to stop freaking out. So I'm going to close my part with just talking briefly about being willing to break white kids' hearts. And I think given the events of the summer, this is particularly important. A couple of years ago, I had a white mom tell me that we were talking about the nation's racial climate. It was probably 2017. And she nodded towards her young white child and she said, "I'm just so grateful she doesn't have to worry about any of this yet." And I totally got what she meant, because I long to protect my children too, as any parent or caregiver does. We are living in very difficult times, violent times. And like any parent, grandparent, or caregiver, I want my kids to have hope about the world. I want my kids to think of the world as a place of possibility. But I'm very clear there's nothing innocent about white innocence. And that in the face of racial injustice, if we choose to try to keep white kids innocent, we are actively bartering away their humanity. And I will not do that with my children. I will not barter away their humanity. I learned this most profoundly in 2016 when some of the students on the college campus I work were organizing a protest. And I invited my kids to come if they wanted to. And I said, my students are coming together to protest. I'll take you if you want to go. And they said, yes, we want to go. They were 6 and 8 at the time. And they said, can we make signs? And I said, sure. Well, what are your signs going to say? And they said, oh, Black Lives Matter. And I said, oh, of course you can make those signs. And so I've taken my kids to protests their whole lives, and by that age, and certainly now, they were old enough to be more fully engaged. They increasingly every year understand more fully what's going on. They spent time participating with young Black and Latino, Latina, Latinx people, Asian American people, other people of color, and a few white people who were just standing together to say no. And they had those same people affirming them for bringing their signs, which was important because they were both being there and experiencing that they have a voice, an anti-racist, agency-filled voice that they can offer, even as children. Our kids need to know that. And so that was how the story ended that day. But the middle part was where I learned about letting my kids have a broken heart, because what happened was I walked downstairs where they were making their signs. And when I walked into the room, I saw my older child sign H, and it said this in green and red marker. My 8-year-old had written, "Black Lives Matter." And below that, she had written, "They matter the same as white." And below that, she had written, "Stop killing them." And then below that, my 8-year-old had written the names of people in her life who she loves. And what her sign said, she'd put her cousins' names on that sign. She said, "People that are Black are T." And she wrote out his name. A, she wrote out his name. And Toby, which is the name of her aunt, my sister-in-law. And I did not just lose my breath. I felt my heart shatter into like a million pieces when I saw my 8-year-old sign. But what I realized in that moment, again, was that these are not days when any of us dare live without a broken heart. Because if our hearts aren't broken, we have already lost so much of our humanity that we're lost. And so what I began to hold on to in that moment was this devastating but really important recognition that at that point, and I think it's still true, my then 8-year-old, this whole wonderful, smart, kind, beautiful, funny, happy child, but she's also already living with a broken heart, and she was young enough to put that on a sign. But she doesn't wake up in despair every day, even as she has a broken heart. She understands, though, that racism is a real thing with real consequences for real people. She knows some of her most beloveds are among those people. And so she knew by age 8 exactly what the stakes were in going to that protest. And the thing is, as devastating as that moment was, I want nothing than my kids' hearts to stay exposed, to risk being broken, because I want my kids to stay human. There's a lot of uncharted territory here, but I'm very clear that the most truthful questions about raising white kids for racial justice are not about how we exactly map or measure our attempts to teach them about justice. The most truthful questions are not the practical ones that tend to make especially white adults freak out and clam up. The most truthful questions simply have to do with whether or not we will decide to be brave. Will we be brave? Raising white kids for justice requires that we expose them to hard realities that their peers are already living with and recognizing every single day. It requires us to create space for them to move into their own relationship with injustice, to allow them to feel it, to touch it, to ache from its costs. And that's tough, and I get it, because it's about letting white kids' hearts get broken. But I am convinced that is the most life-affirming choice that we could make, that I could make for my white kids as a parent, because it's the only way my 2 white kids remain human enough that they will recognize and fight for the humanity of their fellow humans whose lives are actually at stake in the system. And so, with all the uncertainty and the awkward and the fears and the mistakes, I'm convinced my child's humanity and all of our children's lives are absolutely worth that cost. Thank you. So I'm going to invite you to email questions to Sam, and as no shame, no blame. Any question, we need to connect and support each other in this difficult new work.
Absolutely. I saw a few people clapping hard, very, very hard. So thank you very much for your passion and for your thoughtfulness on these issues. My email address is sadams@balibrary.org, and I will just keep refreshing so that I will get those as quickly as possible. I know one thing that's come up in some of our conversations in and around Barrington and just, in general, talking with people I know is it seems very often that, and I know that it's not just happenstance, but, people choose where they're going to live by the schools, right? By the quality of the schools. So they're doing the best they can for their kids, putting them in a school that's highly rated, all those kinds of things. Do you have a response, or what are your thoughts on, when people say, well, I'd like to, send my kids to a more diverse school, but I really want them to get a great education in this school that is 95% white or 90% white,
Yeah.
the top rated school around?
Well, I'd say a few things, starting with humility around, it's very difficult to give parents direct advice about anything relative to their own children. So I sort of say this with real humility. But I would say a couple of things. I would say, one is there's an amazing organization called Integrated Schools, integratedschools.org. They convene families all over the country who are working to collectively choose to not, to white families in particular, to not divest from public education in ways that put our individual children ahead and leave other people's children to thus languish. And so what I want to say is, I of course appreciate, of course, we all want the best for our own children. But there's two things. One, integrated schools leaders talk about the discussion about schools is now the polite way to say racist things without having to own that we are being racist, right? And so even something like quality, like the school I grew up in an integrated school in Denver. I went and spoke there a couple of years ago, and it's this beautiful, mostly student of color school, an elementary school in Denver Public Schools. And white families who live right near it have so fled from the school and chosen into a mostly white school that's not that far away and is overcrowded because they don't even have a space because of standardized test scores. I went to this school. The most amazing things are happening with education there. The most amazing things. But the way we use the word quality, the way we measure that, the way we talk about that, it becomes this insidious cycle because A, it's sometimes actually not even true. But B, the more we respond to it, then we actually take resources from those schools. So it does become difficult for those schools to have stable administrations and teacher, resourcing. And so it's this really horrible cycle. And we have to collectively, I think, decide we're going to invest in everybody's children. And if we aren't, and I say this again with great humility, we need to at least be willing to acknowledge to ourselves, I'm choosing to say I'm putting my kid ahead in a system that then by definition means I'm allowing other people's children who don't have the resource to just up and move to languish. But it's not, individualistic solutions are never effective. We've got to collectively decide that we're not going to just individualize these choices. And that's why a group like Integrated Schools is amazing, because they're helping folks collectively move the needle in different ways. And it's for the good of all of us that we do that. So that's it's really hard. Schools is, I think, the lightning rod for ongoing over-resourcing white kids and under-resourcing kids of color, frankly.
That's wrong. Demetra, did you have any questions you wanted to raise?
Not particularly. I guess I was also going to offer that if anyone had a question and you should have a little yes and no if you bring up the participant window in the meeting. If you so choose to actually ask the question to us live, you can hit the little yes button, and I think I should be able to find you so we can unmute you if you'd like to ask the question. I don't believe your camera will be on the recording because we are spotlighting us three right now. So if you do have a question and you don't want to email, hit the little yes or do something that will tell me that you want to ask something.
So, and for those of you who may have joined us after we went through this explanation, Somewhere between Zoom and myself, we turned off the chat function. I'm not sure exactly how that happened, and it's not allowing me to turn it back on while we are in the midst of a meeting. So our workaround for that is email me at sadams, S as in Sam, Adams at balibrary.org. And I do have a question that's come up, and this also relates to schools, is what are your suggestions for coaching district administration to get on board with raising white children to end the silence? And I think this question is, if you don't mind, answering from both the point of view of a parent and that of a teacher who works in a district. They're trying to bring their district into the light, as it were.
Yeah, yeah. I think teachers have some of the most difficult locations in this larger collective work we need to be about, because they're getting pressure from all, do all this content and curriculum that you didn't get to create. Do it in a very difficult, hour per hour kind of day. Parent backlash. So I so much deep respect and love for K through 12 teachers, especially in public school systems. So a few things. As a parent, I think, given that context, we have to be willing to support and push our buildings and our districts along. Again, especially those of us, like, for example, as a white parent in Des Moines Public Schools, I need to be being vocal about how important multiracial, anti-racist pedagogy, teaching, curriculum are for everybody's children, right? So parents of kids of color will, are always the ones like on the front lines doing this work. And my job as a parent needs to be to step alongside and help amplify that work, because I get listened to more seriously, which isn't correct. I'm not saying, oh, because I'm white. No, but because white parents are often silent on this. So we're very good at getting like peanuts out of the classroom, right? We're good at that. We need to use those skills to get our schools to see that this is an issue of quality education, to learn truthful sort of curriculum. Also, if we do that, we can help the teachers who do have a sort of awareness and passion around this stuff, because it's very difficult for teachers to do this by themselves. And I would say to teachers who do have a passion and are sort of trying to grow and push, I think about it as an organizing strategy. Like, okay, so who in your building, teacher or administrator, can you kind of meet on the side with and say, okay, how can we strategically talk about this together? How can we link arms, right? Because it's easy for us to be kind of picked off if we try it one at a time. It's easy for us to get exhausted trying to make institutional changes. It's very difficult and slow work. So we need to figure out who in our buildings are our allies that we can kind of go, okay, this semester, how are we going to grow the culture here in this way? Okay, this curricular issue, how are we going to, who would be the decision maker we could put some invitation or challenging pressure on around this particular question? And in some buildings, are there some parents that we might even sort of on the side say, hey, we're kind of thinking about this, but we could use some parental push from the back. Like, we need to be kind of strategic. But I do think I say that with real awareness of how difficult this is, because there's so many bureaucratic layers. And so I think teachers really need parents to step in and push on their behalf, and especially then really have their backs if teachers start to get backlash, because white parents do raise backlash stuff when pushes start happening around these kinds of issues. And so I think the strategy part is as important as the content, because it's really such a thick bureaucracy. So, but this problem is a much more difficult one than about any when it comes to how we change those contexts. And so you need other people who are also doing it. I would really look for those folks.
Okay, thank you. I will invite the person who emailed me the question, if they would like to speak up, if you want to add to your question at all. I do have a second question on deck, and then a third one behind that. So the second question I received is, when you introduce inequality and injustice, how do you prevent kids from thinking of their peers as disadvantaged or disempowered versus under-resourced, underinvested, underserved?
Yes, that's such a good question, such an important question, because there's a lot of risk in how we do this. So I'll give you my best response, which doesn't mean I'm doing it perfectly. I think we have to be very mindful of a few things. One, as we talk about race and difference, we do teach about race. We need to teach about racism, teach our kids what it is and how it impacts people's lives. But we also need to talk about race in joyful, celebratory ways too. We need to make sure our kids don't think the only time we talk about race is when we're talking about racism, right? So the race part comes first, I think, almost in a way, like this larger context of all these beautiful differences, and then, oh no, guess what? Sometimes this happens, right? So that racism is not the end of the story. Race and the beautiful differences in our lives is the end of the story. That's one piece. We just have to be really conscious of that. The other thing we need to do is make sure, as we're teaching our kids about racism or trying to make sure they're learning to empathize with or sort of empathize with the way that racism harms people of color, we need to always make sure, and our kids can actually learn this pretty young, even if they don't quite get it, that there are causal factors that lead to inequity, right? So for example, early in my kids' lives, I would talk with them, even though they didn't really get it, about, you know what, it's a form of race. It's a sign of racism that there's not more Black teachers in your schools, right? It's not because Black people can't be teachers. Education systems haven't given equal access, and like we have to make transparent to our children the structures behind how some communities end up under-resourced and the histories too, so that like when we talk about things like Brown versus Board of Education with our kids, we shouldn't teach that just about that was the past and now it's all over. Now we teach Brown versus Board of Education and make sure we do the through line, talk about how even though that happened and yay that happened, we still haven't taken all the steps we need to make sure that everybody gets access to the same high quality education that everyone deserves, right? So that we are making transparent the conditions to our children so that they assume that, oh, that's what happened here. And that stuff begins to translate very early as our kids' brains get more and more sophisticated. Then it will become more natural for them to assume when they see inequity that there's a causal factor that has to do with racism and white supremacy instead of having something to do with innate capacity among people of color. And that question is so important because what happens in so-called colorblindness is our kids see inequity. And since all we've told them is everybody's equal, if you tell a kid everybody's equal, everybody's equal, everybody's equal, and then they see inequity, they conclude, oh, some people just aren't as good at this. That's why everybody's equal talk ends up producing, I think, more virulent forms of racism. So making transparent the causal factors from young ages, our kids are so much more able to understand this than we give them credit for. And not teaching about the civil rights movement as if it's the past, right? The civil rights movement never stopped. What's happening this summer is an extension of the civil rights movement, right? So that it's not like ancient history in their brains. Things like that, I think, are really important.
Okay. I have, this is the question on deck I mentioned, and then another one that came in after that. As the Zoom saying goes, I want to be respectful of everyone's time. It is 8:28. We're hoping that you can stick around with us and that anybody who's in attendance, but I know most of you are probably parents and you may have children who need to get off to bed, that sort of thing. So I just want to give you the 2-minute warning. It is 8:28 now. The next question that we have is, great presentation, and I buy the data that we're hearing. I want to be an anti-racist. I've recently learned that is different than just not being a racist. So great. What advice do you have for those of us living in this community, which is primarily white, to be able to foster conversations with our children? What is the right way to talk about race at the elementary age? Is it as natural as talking about the color of someone's hair or other visible description? I'm just going to interject. The library has copies of Dr. Harvey's book. Put one on hold. It's amazing. I was telling her before we began that, my children are in their 20s, and so I'm not allowed to raise them anymore. I tried, but I learned so much about myself and my own racial development from raising white kids. I think it's invaluable. So I recommend that very highly. She also has a course that's available on her website. And now, do you want me to repeat the question or you got it? Okay.
Okay, so yes, it's as natural as just talking about it, but it's not going to feel as natural because you were probably raised in white silence. So it's going to feel really uncomfortable in a way that, for example, many African-American families, it doesn't feel uncomfortable to talk about differences, because collectively, not every single Black family, we should never generalize any community, but collectively, but the data shows Black families talk about race, and it's generationally have passed this down, in part because Black families have needed to try and enable their children's survival, right? So it's going to feel unnatural, but it is that natural. And so we can do things like lots and lots. If we live in a predominantly white community, part of what we need to do is get lots of media, books, all the over, like really center diversity in our children's sort of panoply of whatever they're doing, toys, books, movies, whatever. Talk about it, name it. Oh, look, that girl has peach skin. I wonder if she's white. Oh, that little boy in that story, he has like brown skin. It's kind of seemed like he might be Latino. I'm not sure, but maybe. I wonder, just we need to just normalize talk about difference. When we do that, then our kids learn they're allowed to talk about this. They assume they should be talking about it. And then all of a sudden they'll ask us all kinds of questions that helps us then continue to know what we need to be saying to them, including if they ask us questions that have a racist inflection in them, which they will. And then we go, oh, I'm to make sure this gets onboarded, right? So that's one piece. The other thing is, I really think most predominantly white communities, I don't know Barrington, but I just heard a little bit about Be The Change, most of them have spaces where people of color are already, anytime there's people of color in a community, even if it's a small number, they are typically involved in organizing and civic engagement. That is one of the most powerful things I've learned from friends and colleagues of color over the years, is that people of color are always organizing because conditions in predominantly white spaces are often very difficult. And so the other thing we can do is seek those spaces out if we are welcome there, and find out if there's ways we can support, engage, be part of those initiatives, and take our kids along when we do that. Not in a voyeuristic, like, oh, let's go immerse ourselves in diversity, but like, no, in our community, we are working to grow and amplify the voices and leadership of people of color, even if they are underrepresented. And our kids will internalize that as a normal, important way you function in the world, that this is who you choose to be in community with. Those are choices we can make in most places, even very, very demographically white places. And I think it's really important that we do that and make it very transparent to our children. So like, for example, I'll just give you one and I'll just shut up. But this summer, one of the things I did this summer, even though the pandemic was raging, and is that, my kids, I've always brought them along with the organizing I do their whole lives. But like this summer, we went, and even though it was the pandemic, so we were staying away of a lot of places, I knew in Des Moines, there was a powerful Black Lives Matter organizing. And I know a number of those organizers, and I knew they were tired. And so like one day I took a number of them who I knew the spirit in which I did that would feel appropriate. I took them food, just dropped, meals off to them. And even though we were going to be in the car 4 hours, I just took my kids along. And I made them come with me. And they were, a little grumpy about it, kind of bored. And I was like, no, this is what we're doing. We are going to feed the folks who right now are leading the struggle in Des Moines where we live, because that's what we need to be doing. I know that developmentally that was important for them, even though they were just sitting in the back seat. I wanted them to know, like, that's not stuff you just deliver with words. Our kids watch what we do, and they won't just learn this stuff if we're not doing it. But if we do it and we're taking them along with us, they will not turn out the way we turned out. When I wallowed in white guilt in my 20s, my kids aren't going to do that. Developmentally, they're going to be beyond white guilt long before their 20s. And because they're going to know they can take action. And so that's my hope for my kids and for generationally what we do with this generation of white youth.
And that, speaking of white guilt, that's a great segue for the next question that we received. And this says, you mentioned how white students feel uncomfortable or almost ashamed to say they are white or to be proud of their race, in a similar way to their Black or brown peers. How do we help our white children feel okay with their own race and still learn to stand up for equity or equality for other races?
Yeah, it's a really important question. There's a few things we need to be doing, and none of them include avoiding it and hoping it's not going to happen, that our white kids get angsty. One is that, again, we need to model action. So part of the reason white youth get angsty and are vulnerable in the ways that they end up vulnerable is because they haven't seen white adults participate in racial justice movements. White young people who do that and who have meaningful engagement in anti-racist, whether it's, movements in the streets, or maybe it's, resourcing communities of color in our city, whatever it looks like, are less likely to think, oh, my whiteness is just a bad thing, because they won't experience that as the end of the story. They experience connection to, even like to my kids, I'll always say, yep, but what kind of white person are we going to be? What kind of white person are we going to be? We cannot just abstractly tell our kids it's okay to be white. That is meaningless statement, because unless we are participating in racial justice, actually that's a complicated thing to say. It is okay to be who you are, but if we are white, if you want to feel good about being white, that means we've got to be engaged alongside people of color to invest in racial justice, right? The other thing is we need to teach our kids that in every justice movement, there was always a few white people who participated, always. So our kids need to know the names of Ann Braden and John Brown and the people today, organizers today, Chris Crass in Louisville, who's just this amazing anti-racist white organizer who's been totally involved in a amplify their work role with Black Lives Matter, organizing there after the Breonna Taylor verdict. And our kids need to know that there are white people that are always choosing this, not so they overestimate how often white people have chosen racial justice, because unfortunately it's very rare, but they need to see that those people have always existed. Harriet Tubman was out, John Brown and Harriet Tubman had a relationship of support, right? And so we need to make sure our kids know that, so that we keep live for them. The question is, it's not about you're bad because you're white. The question is, what kind of white person are you going to be? What kind of white person do you want to be? You have agency about that. And that's what I want my kids to constantly know is an open-ended question. And guilt and shame might happen at points. That's part of the developmental journey. The goal is not to avoid that or try and avoid that. It's to journey with our children through it. So they see when they're feeling, if they do start feeling, my child struggles sometimes, like, oh my God, Europeans did so many bad things. I'm like, yes, they did. Those were our ancestors. And we are in liberation and love in the journey to redress what they did and its contemporary consequences, because we want to reject that. Even we didn't ask them to do that. They did that. I'm so sad they did it. That's why we choose justice every single day. So that's the goal, is to journey with them through guilt, not try and sort of avoid it.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's one of the things that's toughest in some of this work, is that if you're doing it right, it's not comfortable, right? Demetra and I did another program that was not specifically race-based, but we had a couple therapists who were assisting us with that. And one of them had like a sampler on her wall behind her that one of her patients had given her that said, speaking to her as a therapist, if I'm doing my job, if you're comfortable, I'm not doing my job.
Yeah.
Right? And that's kind of the same thing is true with doing anti-racist work. It takes some discomfort and some icky feelings and
we're hoping that the kids will be comfortable with it, right?
Right. Yeah. And no one will put through.
That's the thing, is that with race, because this is a generational problem, right? For white parents, one of the challenging pieces is it's uncomfortable for us because we're having to unlearn all this stuff that our elders did not do. I do think, Demetra, that for the kids, it's not, it says our anxiety, we impose it on them because we are having to work through some anxiety, because it is fraught for us, because we were not taught what we needed to be good allies in this work with communities of color, right? But we don't have to give that to our kids. But that's why even non-parents parents whose kids are in their 20s, so you're not allowed to raise them anymore. That's why this work actually resonates with white adults, is because developmentally, most of us are actually developmentally are in a very early, racial identity development is a thing. And we are at a very early stage as white adults, most of us. My children are developmentally further along in their racial identity than I got until I was almost 30. And that's just psychological, like, now that's psychology. It's not even, I'm not making that up. That's like, there's volumes of work on this. So
yeah.
So that's why it feels uncomfortable, because we developmentally are kind of at a pretty early point, most white adults of this generation, my generation, I'm like 50.
Yeah. So there's just an interesting thing I'll bring up with that. And you mentioned this in your book as well. I was raised by someone who was willing to talk about race and who did actively seek out people of color. And I grew up in Arlington Heights, which is a suburb like another 10 miles east of Barrington. And my parents made an effort in the 70s to seek out people of color to be friends with. My mom was a Head Start teacher, and, but took us to the restaurant that one of her families owned and things of that sort. And so I've always kind of thought, I got this, I'm good, I'm cool. And then realized at a certain point, and actually probably something that either one of my nieces or nephews or my kids said to me, that like my mom in her lifetime had progressed from here to here. And so I was here, and I had moved from here to maybe here, but I hadn't made the strides in anti-racist thinking that my mother, who was born in 1927, made before me, right?
Yeah.
So even if you were raised by someone who did think about things differently, there's still work that each of us needs to do.
Yeah, because we're breathing the smog.
Right, because it's everywhere, Yeah. So, all right. I am going to refresh one more time. It doesn't appear that I have anything else that has come in, and we'll give you one more chance to check the yes box or go to the bottom of your screen and hit one of the reactions if you would like to voice a question. Otherwise, I think we will bring Grant back online with us if we could. And wish everyone a good night. Thank you so much for joining us. We would love to hear you. Oh, I'm sorry. One other quick thing, when you were speaking about the books and the toys and the things like that, I need to give a shout out to Demetra. And we have several members of our youth services department who are on the call today. And I walk through the youth services department on my way to the adult services office. And I can tell you there's no toys out right now. It's very sad. They'll be back. And that is Demetra's oeuvre. That's what she works on. And has made an effort to always have things that are representative of a variety of races and cultures. But definitely the books that we are featuring right now show a range of skin colors, everything across the covers. So if you haven't been to the library recently, please come visit. Don't linger, but come on in, grab some books and get going. But we welcome you to do that as a way of opening up some of those conversations with your kids. And those things are true across the range of ages. The youth services department starts, little, right? Board books up to 8th grade. Upstairs in the young adult department, we have books that are aimed at high schoolers. The Lincoln Award winners particularly are focused on quality books that feature people with a variety of backgrounds, a variety of topics. And then, you and your kids are welcome to go into the book club collection. The Hate U Give is a great, do a parent-child reading club together, things like that.
And picture books are a great way to start conversations with your little ones, just as you would point out stop signs in a book or colors in a book. It's just as easy to point out a child's skin color in a book, or who's in the book, who's not in the book. It's a really great place to start, and it's maybe a little bit more comfortable for parents too, because they're already used to using books in this way. So
And if you aren't used to
highly
using books in that
recommended.
way, Demetra and I have a program on that coming up too. So I'm sorry, Grant, I brought you back on and then I didn't let you say anything or speak at all. So I'll give you a moment if there's anything you'd like to say in wrapping things up. One of the steps of progress that we've made or that, is chugging along is due to some of the work that Grant's organization has done. District 220 has recently hired for the first time a director of equity, diversity, and inclusion. So we're looking forward to progress on those fronts. And I will stop.
Yeah. Again, don't have too much to say. Just thank you, Dr. Harvey. Thank you for being here. Thank you for speaking. And I'm glad that so many people were able to come here and listen to what she had to say. Again, I think the biggest thing that we've all learned, because essentially we're just some meddling kids causing good trouble, is that the smog's still there. The smog will be there long after we leave. Again, didn't expect to be here, but I'm trying to make the most of where I'm at in terms of being back in Barrington, and that's constant progress, constant iteration. And we can't do it alone. We, again, thank the library for being so willing to talk with us. I think that starts with that, talking and having that discussion, and then partnering. Courageous Conversations, Courageous Community, I'll plug them real quick because their next session is tomorrow. So please sign up for that. I'm pretty sure the library has a link. We also have a link on our newsletter. So if you would like to sign up for either of those, please visit the library's webpage, or please visit our Instagram page. We have a link tree there. We have another survey out for narratives, and you can sign up for our newsletter there as well, which will have all of the libraries and Courageous Communities links and resources there. We can sign up, and it's really easy. So again, it takes constant work. And again, it's what got us here won't get us to where we want to go. And I think that's the biggest thing that I'm trying to, instill in the people who I work with, and they're trying to instill in me. And it's an honor to work with them, and an honor to work with you all. And Jennifer Harvey, thank you so much for coming and helping us further that cause as well. I think we're all a better community for being here listening to you today. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you so much.
We have I have just a shout out. Someone asked me, first off, said, thank you so very much for a great presentation, and putting a shout out for kid nonfiction autobiographies or biographies. So thank you. And Courageous Conversations, you can email me for that information, or it's courageousconversations.us. And tomorrow's discussion is with Eric Liu, and I'm not going to remember his credentials, but speaking kind of about the election has passed, how do we move forward from here? So I'm really excited to be going to it tomorrow. So going to it tomorrow, as it were. So again, thank you all very much. And we invite you to join us next week. A week from tonight, we will continue discussing the book and the learning from Dr. Harvey. And in our fourth week, Grant will present some more information from the data and narratives that Be The Change Barrington has gathered, and we'll talk about some practical applications. Dr. Harvey, you're invited if you want to come. It's free on a Tuesday night. The lovely thing about Zoom. So, all right, folks, thank you very, very much for being with us, and we will look forward to further conversations. Bye now.
Thank you.